I noticed too much myself. My previous response was 3,400 words when you asked for 4,600 to 4,800. Here is the corrected full-length script. 33 secretaries had walked out of Celeste Marrow's office in under 4 years, and not one of them lasted longer than a season. I knew the number before I ever shook her hand, because the recruiter said it twice, like a warning she wanted me to actually hear. On my first morning, she handed me a schedule with 27 commitments crammed into one day, several overlapping by minutes, and told me the last man before me hadn't survived until lunch. I looked at the calendar, then at her, and said, "You won't need another secretary after me." She smiled the way people smile at a man who doesn't know what he's just walked into. I am 58 years old. I raise my daughter alone, and I have buried enough jobs to know the difference between a hard position and an engineered one. Celeste Marrow's office was not hard. It was designed. Every contradiction in that first schedule had a shape to it, a rhythm, like footprints pressed into the same soft ground over and over by different feet that never noticed the path they were following. 33 people had walked that path before. None of them had thought to look down. My daughter Rosalind was 17 that year, sharp enough to notice when I came home tired in a new way, the way a man gets tired when a problem follows him out the door. She asked me over dinner what kind of woman fires 33 people and still gets applicants. I told her the kind of woman who isn't looking for a secretary at all. Rosalind laughed like I was being dramatic. I let her believe that, because I hadn't proven it to myself yet, not fully, not on day one, and a father doesn't hand his child a theory before he's tested its weight. By 10 that morning, Celeste had already moved 2 meetings, swapped 3 conference rooms, canceled a flight arrangement, rescheduled an investor briefing, and rewritten an internal presentation from memory without telling anyone why. She gave me instructions that flatly contradicted each other, watching my face the entire time the way a scientist watches a dish under glass. Most men would have scrambled to satisfy her. I didn't scramble. I sat with the contradictions and let them tell me something instead, because panic is a language the previous 33 had all spoken fluently, and it had never once bought them a second week. "You changed the 12 o'clock and the 2 o'clock, I said, "but you left the board call untouched, even though it conflicts with both now." She didn't answer right away. "Which one actually matters to you?" I asked, "because I don't think it's either of the ones you just moved." Something shifted behind her eyes, quick and involuntary, the kind of flicker a poker player spends years learning to hide and still occasionally fails to hide completely, especially in front of someone who has learned to watch for exactly that. None of the others asked that question, she said finally, and there was no warmth in it, only the flat curiosity of someone recalculating a number she thought she already knew. I told her I wasn't interested in guessing what she wanted. I was interested in what she was actually protecting. She didn't answer that either. She simply turned and walked back into her office, and I understood I had passed something, though I couldn't yet say what, only that the air in the room had changed weight the way it does before a storm decides which direction it's going to break. I spent my lunch hour that first day not eating but walking the floor, learning the names of the people who worked around Celeste's orbit without ever quite entering it. A receptionist named Delia told me, without my asking, that the previous secretary had cried in the supply closet before she'd even cleared out her desk. A junior analyst warned me, half joking, half not, to keep a bag packed. Everyone on that floor had built a small private mythology around the woman upstairs, and every version of it ended the same way, with somebody walking out carrying a box they hadn't expected to need. That afternoon I Found the archive, a locked drawer nobody had bothered relabeling since the last of 33 names had been added to it. Personnel files, each one ending the same clinical way, terminated for failure to anticipate executive requirements. 33 variations on the same sentence, written by different hands, in different years, as if the company itself had a template for erasing people who got too close. I laid the dates side by side on my kitchen table that night and saw what nobody upstairs had apparently ever bothered to see. The firings weren't random. They clustered, tight and unmistakable around major corporate decisions and acquisition, a leadership shakeup, a quarterly earnings call that had moved the stock 11 points in a single afternoon. Every time something significant happened inside Merrill Holdings, a secretary disappeared within days of it. Coincidence explains one. It does not explain 33. I sat there long after Rosalind had gone to bed, feeling the particular cold that comes from realizing a pattern is not an accident, but a machine somebody built on purpose and had kept running quietly for years. Rosalind found me still at the table near midnight, the files spread out like a hand of cards nobody wanted to play. She asked if I was in trouble. I told her I wasn't. Not yet, but that I thought I'd walked into something bigger than a secretarial job. Something that had already cost 33 people their careers without any of them understanding why. She studied the dates over my shoulder the way she used to study her math homework, looking for the pattern before she looked for the answer, and told me that whatever I was seeing, I should be careful who I told about it first. She was 17, and she was right, and I didn't forget it. The next morning I compared old calendars against the archived, meeting logs, and the shape sharpened further. Before every major decision, a secretary received contradictory instructions. A meeting got moved without explanation. A document vanished from the executive calendar and reappeared later, altered, as though it had simply been resting somewhere in the meantime. And within a week of that vanishing, someone inside the company always seemed to benefit. A trade made early, a deal closed before the board had formally voted, an advantage that shouldn't have existed yet somehow always did. I began to understand that Celeste wasn't testing whether a person could manage her calendar. Nobody needs to fire 33 people to find someone who can keep time. She was testing something else entirely, and she wasn't going to tell me what it was, because the moment she told me, the test would already be broken. She needed whoever sat at that desk to find it themselves. The same way water finds the crack in a foundation nobody admitted was there, slowly, patiently, without anyone pointing the way. I started suspecting Naomi Bellamy first, because suspicion always goes to whoever has the most access, and Naomi, as chief of staff, had more of it than anyone but Celeste herself. She had outlasted every secretary who came before me, had handled the transition each time one left, and watched me now with the flat patience of someone waiting for a familiar ending. "You'll be gone in a week," she told me on day 3, not unkindly, just tired, like a woman repeating a fact she'd stopped being able to feel anything about anymore, having said it so many times to so many faces she no longer bothered learning. But the shape of Naomi's access didn't match the shape of the damage. She touched everything, yes, but she touched it openly, in the light, where anyone could check her work. Whoever was doing this preferred the seams, the quiet handoffs between departments, the places where a document changed hands and nobody thought to ask who'd held it last. Naomi was too visible to be the one hiding. I set her aside, not cleared, just set aside, the way you set aside a wrong answer that at least teaches you the shape of the right one, and kept working. It was a small discrepancy that turned me in a new direction. An old meeting log claimed a strategy session had run 42 minutes. The buildings, Access records showed the conference room had been occupied for exactly 11 minutes, had been added to an official document after the fact, quietly, by someone who understood that nobody checks a room log unless they already suspect something's wrong. I sat with that number for a long time. 11 minutes doesn't sound like much. It's enough to change a life, and I had started to believe it had changed several. I began pulling similar comparisons across a dozen other old meetings, and the pattern repeated itself with a consistency that stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like a signature. Not every meeting was altered, only the ones that mattered, the ones tied to decisions with money attached to them. Whoever was doing this wasn't sloppy and wasn't greedy in an obvious way. They were patient, surgical, the kind of patient that only comes from someone who has done this so many times they've stopped needing to think about it, the way a man stops noticing his own handwriting. Celeste caught me in the archive. 2 days later, papers spread across the table like a man laying out a case he wasn't ready to argue yet. She didn't ask what I was doing. She never asked the obvious question when a harder one served her better. You're getting close to something you don't understand, she said, and there was no threat in it, only a kind of weary warning, like someone watching a child walk toward a road they already knew was dangerous. Having watched 33 others walk the same road before him, then maybe you should stop giving me incomplete information. I answered, and for the first time since I'd met her, Celeste Merrill laughed. Not because I'd said something clever, because nobody in that building had spoken to her plainly and longer than she probably wanted to admit. It wasn't a warm sound, but it wasn't cold either, and I understood watching her face settle back into its usual discipline, that I had just done something none of the 33 had managed. I had made her forget for 1 second to be careful, and I understood exactly how rare that must have been for her. I found the 33rd Secretaries file the following week, and it was different from the rest. Every other termination note carried the same bloodless language about failed anticipation. Hers had one sentence, unsigned, buried at the bottom of an otherwise empty page. She noticed too much. No explanation, no specifics. Just an admission, hidden where nobody was supposed to go looking for it, that the 33rd person hadn't failed at all. She had succeeded at the wrong thing at the worst possible time, and been removed for it before she could understand what she'd found. That single sentence rearranged everything I thought I understood. These weren't failures being fired for incompetence. They were witnesses being fired for proximity. Some of them had noticed the meeting changes and never connected them to anything larger. Some had caught the document revisions and assumed it was ordinary corporate sloppiness. Some had flagged the travel inconsistencies, the financial briefings rescheduled at suspiciously convenient moments, and been told politely that it wasn't their concern. Every one of them had touched a different piece of the same hidden shape. None of them had held enough pieces to see it whole, and I finally understood that I couldn't afford to make their mistake. I began to understand why Celeste kept restarting the experiment instead of simply investigating the problem herself. If she went looking directly, whoever was doing this would see her coming and bury the evidence deeper than she could dig. But if she let the chaos of her office churn through person after person, each one stumbling across a fragment before being removed, she could watch from a careful distance which fragments kept surfacing and which ones never did. 33 secretaries weren't casualties. They were instruments, and she had been reading the notes they left behind without ever admitting, even to herself, what she was really building. The cruelest part was that she couldn't simply trust the ones who noticed something either, because once a person noticed, she had no way of knowing whether they'd found it honestly or had been fed the discovery by whoever was orchestrating it. Every secretary who got close became, in her eyes, a possible extension of the very thing she was hunting. So she removed them before that question could poison her further, and started again and again, 33 times, because trust built on an unanswerable doubt isn't trust at all. It's just a slower, more exhausting kind of fear, dressed up to look like discipline. Understanding that didn't make my job easier. It made it heavier. Because now I knew that whatever I found, whatever conclusion I eventually reached, Celeste would have to decide whether to believe it came from me, or from whoever had been managing this cycle from inside her own walls the entire time. I couldn't simply present evidence. I had to present it in a way that proved, beyond argument, that I hadn't been fed a single piece of it. That meant slowing down. It meant building something Celeste couldn't dismiss, because it would prove itself without needing my word attached to it. Naomi's attitude toward me began to shift somewhere in that stretch of weeks. She stopped predicting my departure, and started instead quietly answering the questions I asked her, giving me context on old decisions without asking why I wanted it. I think she recognized before I said anything to her directly that I wasn't trying to outmaneuver her the way she'd assumed every new secretary eventually tried to. "You're not managing Celeste," she told me one evening, staying late without being asked. "You're studying her. Nobody's done that before. They've all just tried to survive her." Victor Sloan, the general counsel, found me in the archive not long after, quiet and precise as always, and told me things about Celeste's history that nobody else in the building seemed willing to say out loud. Her father had built the company and lost it once already, to a partner he trusted completely, a betrayal so total it had reshaped how Celeste understood every relationship that came after it. Victor didn't offer this as gossip. He offered it as a key, the kind a careful man hands over only once he's decided you're not going to misuse it, and I understood, listening to him, exactly why control had become the only language Celeste trusted. I began mapping the administrative layer the way another man might map a crime scene, tracing every document from its origin to its destination, and marking every hand it passed through in between. Calendar changes, meeting invitations, document routing, travel schedules, approval reminders. None of it looked dangerous in isolation. A moved meeting is nothing. A late document is nothing. But laid side by side, in sequence across 4 years, they formed a second version of Celeste's company that ran quietly beneath the one she thought she was governing. A shadow schedule built entirely out of small, deniable delays. The pattern converged, slowly and then all at once, on Adrian Vale, the chief financial officer. A man polished enough that nobody had ever thought to ask why every disruption seemed to land in his favor. He wasn't the one physically altering documents most of the time. He didn't need to be. He simply benefited, consistently, from a chain of small administrative accidents that never quite traced back to a single author, because whoever built this system had understood something I'd learned a long time ago in my own career. A mistake with no clear owner gets blamed on whoever happens to be standing closest, and the person always standing closest was the secretary. I didn't accuse him. An accusation without proof would have made me indistinguishable from every failed guess that came before me. And worse, it would have handed Celeste exactly the kind of uncertainty that had cost 33 people their jobs. So I built a test of my own, quiet and controlled, the way you'd set a trap without ever telling the animal it existed. I created 3 versions of a harmless executive schedule, each containing a slightly different piece of information, and I made sure only one person in the building ever received the critical detail. Then I waited. 3 days later, That detail surfaced in a place it had no reason to be, in a casual remark Adrian made in a hallway to someone who shouldn't have known it, in a line item that appeared in a report he hadn't been given the raw numbers for. I ran the test twice more, varying the details, varying the routes, and each time the leak traced back to information that had only ever passed through one narrow channel on its way to him. It wasn't a guess anymore. It was proof, built the same patient way I'd built everything else, quietly, without asking anyone to simply take my word for it, and without letting a single test look like anything more than routine administration. I brought it to Celeste on a Thursday evening, after the floor had emptied and the building had gone that particular kind of quiet that makes even small sounds feel significant. I laid out 4 years of calendar changes, the 11 stolen minutes, the 33rd Secretary's unsigned sentence, and the 3 controlled tests that all pointed the same direction. I didn't ask her to trust me. I told her to check every piece herself. "I'm not asking you to believe me," I said. "I'm asking you to verify me. That's the difference between me and the people you were afraid of." She went through it in silence for a long time, the kind of silence that isn't empty but full, crowded with 4 years of decisions she was suddenly seeing from a different angle. When she finally looked up, her voice was quieter than I'd heard it since the morning she'd handed me that impossible schedule. "You found it before I told you it existed," she said. "Nobody else got that far without me pointing them there first." I told her that wasn't luck. It was the same thing I'd told her on my first morning, though neither of us had understood it the same way then. Not really. Not until this table between us was covered in proof instead of assumption. I said, "I'm the last secretary you'll need," I told her, "and you thought that was arrogance. It wasn't. I was telling you I already understood the real job, even if I couldn't have named it yet." She studied me the way she'd studied that first schedule, searching for the flaw she was certain had to be there. She didn't find one, because there wasn't one to find. I hadn't survived her office by managing her. I had survived it by refusing to be managed, and by refusing ever to stop watching, even on the days it would have been easier not to. The confrontation with Adrian happened 3 days later, in a boardroom full of people who had spent a decade calling him indispensable. He tried to turn the room the way men like that always do, appealing to tenure, to loyalty, to the absurdity of trusting a secretary hired weeks earlier over a chief financial officer who had built half the company's infrastructure himself. "Are you seriously going to take his word over mine?" he said, looking at the board rather than at me, because he'd already decided I wasn't worth addressing directly, a small miscalculation that turned out to matter more than he expected. I didn't answer with heat, because heat is what men reach for when they don't have proof. I answered with 6 words. I'd trust the evidence instead. Then I opened the folder and let the calendar discrepancies, the access logs, the 3 controlled tests speak for themselves, each one landing in the silence like a door closing somewhere down a long hallway. Nobody in that room had come to watch a secretary dismantle a chief financial officer. But that is exactly what the evidence, laid out in order, quietly did, page by page, without a single raised voice to help it along. The internal investigation that followed confirmed everything within the week, methodically, without drama, the way truth tends to arrive once nobody is left to obstruct it. Celeste didn't gloat when it was over. She wasn't built for gloating, and I don't think she'd have known how, even if she'd wanted to. She simply placed a termination letter on the desk in front of Adrian and watched him read it in a silence that told him, more clearly than any speech could have, that whatever protection his decade of tenure had once bought him had finally run out. all at once on a Thursday. All of this, he said, looking at me with something bitter twisting behind his composure, over a secretary. Celeste let the silence stretch long enough to become its own answer, before she finally gave him one. No, she said. Over the fact that I finally let someone tell me the truth instead of managing me around it. He had nothing to say back to that. He gathered his coat, and the door closed behind him on 10 years of quiet damage nobody had thought to add up until now. 10 years that a single locked drawer full of 33 files had finally undone. The weeks after Adrian's departure were strange in a way I hadn't expected. The floor that had braced itself every Monday morning for years began, cautiously, to breathe. Naomi told me privately that she'd stopped waiting for my desk to empty. Delia, the receptionist, started leaving a second cup of coffee on my desk without being asked. A small thing, but the kind of small thing that means a place has decided you're not temporary anymore. Even the whispers that used to trail me through the hallway changed their shape, from betting pools to something closer to relief. Victor Sloan came to see me once, more before it was over. This time not to give me history but to ask a question. He wanted to know if I intended to push for Celeste to reach back out to the 33 names in that drawer, to correct the record for people who had spent years believing they'd simply failed at something ordinary. I told him I did. Some of them had rebuilt their lives and wouldn't want the past reopened. But every one of them deserved to know plainly that the pattern that broke them had never been their fault, and that somebody had finally proven it. Celeste hesitated when I raised it with her, longer than I expected. Rewriting 33 termination letters meant admitting, in writing, that she had spent 4 years sacrificing people to protect a company she loved more than she trusted anyone inside it. But she made the calls, one by one over the following month, and I watched her come out of each one a little less armored than she'd gone in. She told me once, after a particularly difficult conversation with a woman who had left the industry entirely rather than risk another firing like the one that had broken her, that saying the truth out loud cost more than any negotiation she'd ever closed. Celeste offered me a new position not long after, Chief of Staff, a title with real authority attached to it, more power than any secretary before me had ever been trusted with. She slid the contract across her desk the same way she'd slid that impossible schedule across it on my first morning, watching my face for whatever she expected to find there. I read it slowly. Then I told her no, and I watched the surprise move across her face before she could discipline it back into stillness, a flicker she hadn't managed to control in front of anyone else in years. You don't need another person working for you, I said. You need people around you who aren't afraid to tell you when you're wrong. A title doesn't fix that. It just gives whoever holds it more room to disappear inside. She was quiet for a long moment, turning that over the way she turned over everything, testing it for the flaw she expected every offer to eventually reveal. This time, again she didn't find one, and something in her posture finally loosened, just slightly, like a hand releasing a grip it had held so long it had forgotten it was clenched. She restructured her entire executive office in the weeks that followed, so that no single administrative channel could ever again control what information reached her desk. Naomi stayed on, no longer suspicious of me, no longer bracing for the inevitable morning I'd fail like everyone before me. Rosalind asked me one evening whether I was ever afraid, walking into an office that had already destroyed 33 careers before mine. I told her the truth. I wasn't afraid of the workload. I was afraid of missing the pattern underneath it, because the workload was never the real job, and it never had been. On the evening I finally left, having decided the position I wanted wasn't a title at all, Celeste called my name as I reached the door. I turned, and she looked at me the way she'd looked at me that very first morning, except nothing about the look was the same anymore. "Malcolm," she said, "you really were the last secretary I needed." And this time, neither of us was talking about the job, and I didn't correct her, because for once there was nothing in what she'd said that needed correcting at all, not one word of it. I think about the 33 names sometimes, the ones filed away with the same clinical sentence stamped across each folder. They weren't failures. They were fragments of a pattern nobody had ever asked them to see whole, discarded the moment they got close enough to matter. I didn't succeed because I was smarter than any of them. I succeeded because I refused to manage the chaos in front of me and started asking, instead, what the chaos was quietly protecting. A difficult person isn't always the problem. Sometimes the pattern around them is, and somebody eventually has to be willing to stay still long enough to see it, no matter how long it takes, or how many people had to walk away first.